Welcome everybody to our introductory lecture. Today we're going to be focusing on laying down some of the groundwork for the rest of the course and introducing some of the themes that we'll be covering early on. Now I have a question. I like to start each lecture with a question, so this will be pretty typical. I would encourage you to write this down. And the question was, how did the interplay of political, economic, social, and cultural forces in Europe from the 14th to the 17th century lay the groundwork for the modern world? So pause the video if you need to, but otherwise, let's get started. So, keeping with this notion of laying down some of the groundwork, we're going to be setting the stage for where and when we're going to be talking about. So we're talking in this lecture and the next couple really about the early modern period. And this is kind of a transitional period, as you can see here, between the late Middle Ages and the modern period. Modern periods usually, most historians consider the French Revolution, 1789, to kind of be dividing line for the modern era. So it's kind of this 1600s. We're going to be laying some of the groundwork because that's where we'll be for the next couple of lectures. And then the place. We're going to primarily be talking about Europe, but we're also going to have to talk about its interactions with some other places. It's because during this time that Europe goes from being basically a backwater to being the dominant civilization on the planet. Certainly by the 19th century, Europeans controlled a large part of the planet. So we'll have to be taking that into account as well. So we're going to be talking about an era of transformation. Transformation from the medieval world and into the early modern world, as we said. And this is going to have some fundamental changes in politics, economics, society, and culture. And these are four categories that we'll talk a lot about during the course. Historians like to organize their thought, organize their material into certain typical boxes, and one is going to be politics. The other one is going to be economics, society or social structures, and then culture, which is a little bit harder to define, but we'll talk about it. Another thing that I want to focus on is how changes in one area, say politics, influence economics or society or culture, and vice versa. All right. So when we're talking about politics, we really can't understand it in isolation because all these things have an interplay with each other. So some of the key themes that I want us to watch out for today is power dynamics. Power dynamics, who's in power, and particularly shifts in power. So we're going to see different players like the church, the monarchy, parliaments shifting in power. We're going to see the emergence of new power centers like nation states and merchant classes that weren't even really big players in prior periods. We're also going to look at social and economic transformations. This is the second major thing that I would like us to be aware of. Social and economic change. And so we're going to see changes in the economic structure as we move out of the Middle Ages, changes in economic practices. We're going to see society become much more mobile socially. So people are going to be able to move out of the category that they're born into and into new categories, which is something that really accelerates in this period of time. The third major thing that I want to talk about is ideas and their consequences. So ideas are really important. They can really change the way that people think, and especially when many people buy into an idea. So we're going to look at new ideas in these early lectures, like the scientific revolution, some new philosophical ideas, and this is really going to blow up people's paradigms. It's going to blow up the models that they use to look at the world. And they're also going to have political implications. So we're going to look at the relationship between some of these intellectual ideas and political change. Finally, the last major theme that I want to talk about is cultural development. So one of the things we'll look at is how art and literature reflect societal change, and also how education and knowledge, the way it's produced, the way it's disseminated, the way it's spread out, begins to change. All right. So those are the four key themes: power dynamics, social and economic transformations, ideas and their consequences, and cultural developments. So what I want to do now is I want to really get into the heart of this lecture, and I want to look at the political landscapes. All right, so shifting landscapes brought about a massive shift in authority and power. All right, so as you can see here, there's two maps jumping back and forth. One is Europe in the 1300s, and the other one is Europe in 1740, and I think you can see a pretty big change. One of the key things to understand about the Middle Ages is that power tended to be decentralized. All right, so in the Middle Ages, the dominant form of political organization was something called feudalism. All right, this was based around the idea of land ownership in return for military service. So during the Middle Ages, when institutions were much weaker than they are today, oftentimes a lord would lease out his land. He would give over his land to a noble in return for some sort of guarantee that that noble would fight on their behalf. All right. What's going to happen, and we're going to see this develop, is a shift away from feudalism and a shift to a more centralized form of government, where the nation or the state, the king, is going to have much greater amounts of authority than he did in the Middle Ages. Monarchs are going to gradually begin to consolidate power. All right? They're going to create bureaucracies. These are going to be organizations that help them administer the territory. They're going to establish standing armies. And in this way, they're going to be able to not only defend their own borders, but they're also going to be able to stand down any nobles who want to test their authority. This was a common thing that kings had to deal with in the Middle Ages. Kings were not that powerful, and oftentimes nobles would ignore, or in some cases just fight against the king. And we're going to see that that becomes a thing of the past. There's centralized power in the hands of the king are going to become more prevalent than powers at the hands of nobles. And what this is going to do is this is going to start a big debate in Europe. And it's going to start a debate in Europe on, if we're going to consolidate power, how should it be? Should the power be in the hands of a king who's absolute, in other words, what he says, his word goes, or should we have some checks on the king's power? Maybe a constitution. Maybe have a body of people like a parliament or a congress that the king has to talk to and has to negotiate with. And so these are going to be some of the big debates. And we'll spend the whole lecture on those. We're also going to see tensions between monarchs and other powers. So as kings become more powerful, they're going to get into greater amounts of conflict with nobility or churchmen. We're going to see some of these groups try to counteract the power of the king by forming parliaments or other bodies. And so this is going to be one of the major power shifts that we see, is authority away from feudal lords and toward monarchs. Another thing we're going to see is the rise of the nation state. All right. So during the Middle Ages, people's national identity, the language that they spoke, the customs that they had, weren't really a major factor in their identity the way they would become later. All right. So nowadays we kind of think of a country like, say, France, and we say, okay, yeah, well, that's where the French people live, or Poland is where the Polish people live. All right. And this is really a pretty modern creation. Things were a lot more complicated in the Middle Ages. It wasn't uncommon to have different groups of people who spoke different languages and different cultures, all part of the same territory or empire. But this is really something that we're going to see develop, is the idea that people who speak a common language, have a common culture, belong in the same state or the same political organization. All right. We're going to start to see the standardization of these languages, of laws within these nations as they begin to form. We're going to see the development of bureaucracies, again. So the rise of the nation state and the centralized monarchy, they go hand in hand. Rise of these bureaucracies, the rise of professional standing armies. And we're also going to start to see rivalries begin to emerge between states and also the nationalities that live in that state. Particularly in the 19th and 20th century, this is going to be a big thing as people start to take more national pride, and as these states begin to emerge, they're going to lead to some conflict and some war. All right. And so these are some of the big political developments to keep our eye on. Another thing that we will mention is we're going to mention the growth of trade, economic developments. This period of time is going to see a big expansion in maritime exploration. So different trade routes are going to begin to develop. Traditionally in the Middle Ages, this trade route here, this was the Silk Road, which connected all of Africa, Eurasia, and Middle East together into a trade web. It's during our period of time that we're going to be looking at that the Americas are discovered, at least from the European perspective. Australia is going to be discovered, and the world is really going to be wrapped together into a web. To go along with this, we're going to see the rise of banking systems. So new forms of finance, new forms of capitalist enterprise. These are going to become important developments. We're going to see the formation of trading companies, like joint stock companies, which are going to be the forerunners to today's corporations. We're going to see the emergence of early capitalism. There's going to be a shift in power from the feudal lords and the feudal nobles and their economy. This is the economy of the Middle Ages is going to be overwhelmingly based on agriculture. All right. To be wealthy in the Middle Ages meant that you had a lot of land for agriculture, but as trade becomes more and more important, we're going to see new players emerge. We're going to see merchants, and we're going to see bankers start to become really, really important people. We're going to start to see the rise of skilled craftsmen, and they're going to become important players as they produce things. We're going to see greater amounts of urbanization as more and more people move to city and the markets that exist in cities. And we're going to start to see the beginning of kind of an industrial process take place. The Industrial Revolution itself won't really happen until the 1800s, but we're going to see the foundations laid here as there's increasing sophistication. All right, and so these new classes are going to emerge. And again, this is a new power group that's going to come in, and they're really going to gain at the expense of the feudal nobility. All right. Finally, we're going to look at the impact of exploration and colonialism. It's going to be during this early modern period that the voyages of discovery really begin to have an impact. The Portuguese are going to start in the 1400s, really beginning to explore Africa. It's really going to be in the 1500s, though, that the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, the discovery of Americas, all of those things are going to take place. We're going to see how colonialism begins to impact the global economic patterns as countries start to form colonial outposts in different places. They begin to extract resources. And we're going to see the impact that new resources and goods and how they're going to transform the European economy. So new crops are going to have an impact. And also having a massive amount of gold that's discovered is going to increase the well, it's going to cause inflation in Europe itself, and this is going to have pretty bad impact. I mean, as I record this now in 2024, we've been dealing with inflation for the past couple of years, and it's really upset. And we have relatively low inflation compared to what was happening in the 15 and 1600s. And so, yes. Finally, or next to finally, we're going to look at social structures. We're going to look at the changing role of the nobility. In the Middle Ages, the nobility were people who were important to society because they fought. It was the nobles who made up most of the knights of the Middle Ages. But with new techniques in warfare, knights become less important. Once guns are developed, it's pretty easy to take down somebody on a horse. And this means that nobles are going to need to reinvent themselves to some degree. If they're not going to be useful in the military, which is kind of the whole reason that they existed, what are they going to do? And so what we're going to see is that nobles lose a lot of power as they lose their military role, but they find new niches by serving in king's courts. And so they're really going to be subordinated in a new way to these monarchs. We're also going to see some conflicts between the old nobility and these monarchs, and also the old nobility and a rising new group in society, and that is the middle class, sometimes called the bourgeoisie. All right, and we'll talk a lot about these folks. They're kind of, if anybody's the star of the show here, it's going to be the bourgeoisie. And the middle class are going to be these people who emerge out of towns and cities, which don't really exist in the Middle Ages. Merchants and traders are going to begin to gain wealth. They're going to begin to gain influence. Skilled artisans and professionals are going to begin to emerge, and as people are buying and selling their products, they're going to begin to increase their social prominence. Merchants are going to become really important players in society, especially as kings need money. Professionals are going to become really important, and they're going to have growing political influence. And this is going to begin to challenge some of the traditional hierarchies. Some of those who were important in the old system are going to fall in importance, while some of those who were unimportant in the Middle Ages are going to begin to rise in importance. And again, this is going to cause tension. And so this is an example of how society and the economy are intertwined and how power dynamics are at play. As one group loses prestige and the other group gains. All right. I also want to talk a little bit about the peasantry and the urban poor. They were undergoing a major transformation themselves. Now, most people in the early modern period are still going to be peasants. That is, they're going to be engaged in agricultural work. But a growing number of these poorer people are going to begin to find their way to cities, where they'll hopefully get some sort of a skill or find at least a place in the urban economy. And in the process, they will hopefully move up. The cities will provide this opportunity for them. We're going to see that the peasantry itself is going to, even those who stay in the countryside, they're going to face new challenges as the economy changes, as nobles try to scavenge some of their prestige by taxing their peasantry more, as they begin to feel, as nobles feel like they're losing out in this economy. All right, and so all of these different groups are going to see some important developments. All right, the last thing that I want to do is I want to talk about this cultural category. All right, and so as society undergoes all of these structural changes that we talked about, the world of ideas was also in flux. The cultural and intellectual developments of this period both reflect and drove social change. So again, it's not like these all of these things happened and they just influenced ideas and culture. That was part of the story, but there was like a two-way street, right? Ideas are also going to challenge the way that people think and how they're going to act. So one of the big things to emerge out of this period of time, the 14 and 1500s, is a movement called the Renaissance, which I think most people are familiar with. So some of the foundational aspects of the Renaissance are going to be the revival of classical learning and humanist thought. By classical learning, we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans. So ancient texts are going to be rediscovered, and in these ancient texts, scholars are going to find a different worldview that wasn't that popular in the Middle Ages. And it's going to be an idea, it's going to be a worldview that really emphasizes humans and human potential and individuals and creativity and many of the ideas that we really associate with the Renaissance. And this will, in turn, spark an interest in secular learning, non-religious learning, all right? And secular education that's not biblically based at schools and universities. And probably what the Renaissance is most famous for is a flourishing of arts and sciences. So innovative paintings and sculptures and architecture comes out of this period of time. There's also going to be scientific advances like anatomy and astronomy and other sciences. And so these educational, these artistic, these scientific developments are both a reflection of what's going on as the early modern world becomes more dynamic and more open to change. And they're also going to help drive this as some of these new ideas about human potential make their way into the population. Another major event is is something called the Protestant Reformation, which happened in the 15th and 1600s for the most part. It's a massive religious conflict. It starts with a monk by the name of Martin Luther, and without going into a great deal of detail about what his particular gripes with the church were, he ends up starting a massive divide within the Catholic Church. Some people are going to subscribe to Luther's ideas. These people will become known as Protestants. Other people are going to remain Catholic, and so they'll continue to be called Catholics. And so there's going to be a divide in Western Europe, whereas in the Middle Ages everybody was Catholic. Now there's going to be Catholics and Protestants. And even in those countries that stay Catholic, the power of the church is going to be greatly challenged. And so the church is going to lose in authority as a result of Luther's doctrines. Obviously, in Protestant countries, the Catholic Church isn't going to really be a major player at all anymore. But like I said, even in Catholic countries, the power of the church is going to diminish in favor of monarchs. And so there's going to be this divide. But then Protestants themselves are going to disagree about what the proper interpretation is. And so you're going to see different groups of Protestants. You may have heard of some of them, like Baptists and Lutherans and Calvins and Anglicans and all of those churches that confuse you as you drive by them. One of the big things that's going to happen in the 15 and 1600s is that things are going to get so testy between these groups as there's going to be big religious wars. And we'll touch on some of them as we move forward. And so again, this is a big power development, a shift in the dynamics of who is in authority. And last but not least, early scientific developments. We're going to see that different people are going to come along and they're going to begin to question traditional knowledge and authority. Traditionally, people in the Middle Ages had a great deal of respect for the ancient Greeks. Books that were written by some of the ancient Greeks were still used as scientific textbooks by the 1500s, but we're going to see that people are going to challenge that. And they're going to challenge this based on empirical grounds. Empirical is a fancy word. We'll get to know it, but basically what that means is using your eyes, doing experiments, figuring it out for yourself, okay? And we're also going to start to see some important developments in astronomy and physics and in different types of philosophies. The focus of people in 1500s still believe that the Earth is at the center of the universe. We're going to see that idea gets challenged and replaced by an idea where the sun becomes the center of the universe. The geocentric model is where the Earth is at the center, and the heliocentric model is where the sun is at the center. And it's admittedly just an astronomical idea, really. But it's going to have a big impact just on the way people's place in the universe, right? Think about, growing up your entire life thinking that you are at the center of the universe, and then to have that idea challenged. All right. Now, to be fair, people didn't think they were at the center of the universe because they thought they were better. In some ways, being at the center of the universe was worse. So I don't want to imply that people were pig-headed or anything. But we're going to see it's going to be a big change in the way that people view themselves. And we're going to lay down the foundations for the scientific revolution. All right, that's going to come along in the 16 and 1700s. All right, so these are going to be some of the major ideas that we wrestle with as we go along, and I wanted to introduce them to you in this first lecture. So, again, I would like you to take some time to think about this. How did the interplay between political, economic, social, and cultural forces in Europe from the 14th to 17th century lay the groundwork for the modern world? All right, and I'll see you for our next lecture.